Hello, agents and agitators. My name is TV's Guy, and oh, okay. There's an animated short out for Valorant. Huh. If I sound surprised, it's because I am. Well, I'm not surprised that there's some kind of animated something out for Valorant, but I'm surprised that it takes this particular form. Because Valorant, as a thing, like the way that Riot has positioned it as a thing in the gaming space is that it's sort of the halfway point between games like CSGO and hero shooters like Overwatch, in the sense that it takes a lot of like the more interesting character design and the more well-realized world of a game like Overwatch, and then combines it with the somewhat more down-to-earth sensibilities of a CSGO tactical shooter without like the overt focus on the Saturday morning cartoon shenanigans that game tried to promote itself on and then really failed to promote itself on when it got stuck in obsessing over esports instead of actually developing its characters and lore. Anyway, I'm salty about that. Never mind. My impression of Valorant was that Riot wanted to promote the game much more on the sense of its gameplay rather than its story, lore, and characters. And certainly that's been the tone of their marketing so far. Lots of sizzle reels, lots of like modern hip-hop and pop songs playing underneath gameplay montages of characters doing really badass stuff, typically from a first-person perspective. And so my sensation was, okay, they're not really gonna promote the story very hard. Like, it's gonna be there in the background, it's gonna be around for people who want to dig into it, but it's not gonna be a primary part of the marketing of the game. And then this thing comes out, and certainly to some extent seems to prove me wrong, because this is a story cinematic. Not that there's that much story in it, like 2 or 3 things happen over the course of the thing, and then we get this shot. But we do get, as I'll just pause and go back for a second, Episode 1, Ignition. Now, Episode 1 is the kind of thing that teases that there might be Episodes 2, 3, 4, 5, and perhaps 27 coming up somewhere down the line. Now, I wouldn't hold my breath for that necessarily. Probably there's going to be more than one. My sense is still that they don't really want to promote Valorant, especially on the lore and the story and the characters and stuff like that, that they want to focus on Valorant primarily as a gameplay experience. But this at least is very interesting to me. So let's do what we do on this channel and very, very slowly go through this less than 2 minutes animated short and talk about it for, oh, I don't know, let's say an hour and a half, 2 hours, 5 hours. I mean, what else does anyone have to do? Anyway, it's not like people have lives. I certainly don't. So we begin the animated short with, well, the kind of thing that you usually start an animated short with. We have an establishing shot of the area, and then that establishing shot is given a little bit more context when we're told that it takes place in, if the menu would stop popping up, in Italy. It's down there at the bottom. Prologue, Duelists. Cool. So we have a sense of where we are, and then we get an establishment of the action, which happens right down here with poof. Now, one thing to talk about. I've talked previously about Riot's other animated shorts, the Legends of Runeterra shorts, Tales of Runeterra they're called. And some of the same animation techniques are on display here, in the sense that what we're looking at here is not a fully rendered 3D environment. Like, they didn't sculpt all of these things in a 3D space. These are 2D illustrations that are painted in separate layers so that they can be scrolled in parallax relative to each other. You can see that happening with the tower here on the side, to give a little bit of sense of depth to the space. And then the building down there where we get the flame spout coming out of, you can see that that's probably drawn on a separate layer on its own, with this bit of the building as a forward layer and then the rest of it in the back, so that the flames can be rendered on top of it. That kind of thing. And the flames themselves, and say it with me, folks, are animated on 2s. Now, what does that mean? In animation, especially like traditional hand-drawn animation, you talk about frame rates in a particular way. So if you have a video that's playing back at 24 frames per second, which is your standard sort of cinematic aspect for video playback, then in Disney animation, typically, you would have characters that are animated on 2s and 3s, which means that for every 2 frames of those 24 frames per second, an animator will sit down and draw 1 drawing, or maybe they'll do it for every 3 frames. And then when you get into limited animation, which is typically stuff like anime tends to live in that space, but certainly also Western animation often does, that's when you animate on 3s or 4s or 5s, depending on the needs of the scene and how much budget you have to realize it with. And animating on those different frame rates, like animating on those different timings, creates different feelings in the animation. So 3D animation, as you can see here, every time I advance and retract a frame, is typically animated on ones. This is not always true. If you take a look at a movie like Into the Spider-Verse, for example, that movie really creatively uses different rates of animation to communicate stuff about the characters. But typically in 3D animation, 3D objects are animated on ones because, well, I mean, the computer doesn't care. It just renders more frames, and it doesn't really have the same labor requirement that an animator has, where they have to draw a new drawing and draw a new drawing and draw a new drawing, where animating on animating on ones, which is the smoothest animation you can get, is so labor intensive that it's usually not worth it. A computer, on the other hand, doesn't care. It just needs a little bit more render time. So the pouch, as it flies through the air here, is animated on ones. And so is the flame that is coming off the pouch. You can see that the flame also moves on every single frame as we hit back and forth. The same thing goes for the smoke in the background. That, too, seems to be animated pretty much on ones. But now look at the flames, especially these ones right here. You see how they don't move? And then they move, and then they don't move, and then they move. And they're not animated strictly on twos, I think. They're animated, you can see they move for 2 frames, and they stop for 1, move for 2, stop for 1, move for 2, stop for 1. And that's part of what gives them that particular aesthetic of movement that they have. Like, you can see they have that slightly more jerky motion. And that works really well for fire, because fire has that sort of chaotic, unpredictable nature to it. So having that different animation timing actually does help it. But something that's interesting about the flame is that, as you can see here, between these 2 frames, right? This flame right here doesn't move. The flames over here do not really move, but some of the flames, different layers of the flame, do change. But then on the layer when the flames in the foreground change, you can see that those flames in the back layers don't change as much. So they're animated on not strictly on 2s, I think they're animated like a 1.5s. Something, I don't really know exactly how what the rate is that they're animated at. You'd have to ask the animator. But they're animated at slightly different rates, like with a slightly offset timing, which creates a really nice sense of depth and chaos and movement in the background of the fire. We'll talk about that more. There's plenty of fire in this thing, because Phoenix is one of the main characters. But we'll talk about that more. Anyway, back to sort of the film theory perspective. We get this setup shot. This is the location. Then we get a secondary setup shot, rather. That before we saw the location, and now we see the object of conflict. This is what everything that's about to happen in this short is about. It's a conflict over the bag and the glowy, mysterious thing that is within it. Specifically, it turns out to be a spike. And then we get an introduction to our main character. This is our protagonist, at least for the purposes of this short. Not necessarily the good guy, but the guy whose perspective we see most things happen from. And then, in just a second, we're going to get our deuteragonist, and we'll also get a little bit of a clever play on time. So his character animation, again, you can see he's 3D animated, so he mostly moves on ones. But he's also animated with an interesting weight to him, especially here. You see that little slide he does? Especially look at his back leg here, where like he has run forward, he's planted all his weight on this foot, and then he's about to push forward into the wall, and then we get this interesting little slide of the foot in there. There's something about the weight of this character that's really interesting. Not bad, and I'm not saying necessarily good or great either, but there's something interesting about the way that they handle weight on the characters in this thing that I think we'll talk about more once Jet gets introduced. Anyway, once again, the flames in the background, you can see how some parts of the flames move, and then the other flames move, and then the whole thing moves together, and then some of it moves, and then the other bit moves, and then the whole thing moves together. So you have this 3-frame cycle of motion in the fire that, when you see it in actual motion, looks really good. Like, you get that really sense of that chaotic, burning, like, blaze of flames just roaring into the air. And that's part of what gives you that sense, is the timing of the things that is going on with the animation. Now let's talk about the character animation, especially the facial animation, because there's some really good stuff here. Now, you can't hear the audio of what this guy is saying right now, but you know exactly what his mood is. And that's the mark of good character animation is, well, like, the tragedy of good animation is that when animation is really good, you don't notice it. Like, you just see, oh, it's a person doing acting, or rather, it's a character doing acting. What you don't think about is that somewhere, someone sitting behind a computer with a mouse or some other clever creative tool had to move every single part of this character's body, every little twitch of a muscle, every little movement of any part of them is a decision that an animator takes in order to communicate a performance to you. It's the most elaborate puppet show on the face of the earth. And so when he smashes into the wall here, like that bump, see how his hair reacts. There, you see that the little strands of hair kind of swinging up and then coming down again. You see how he reacts with his body, where you can see like he's been at a run and he's kind of winded a little bit, and you can see that on his face, that like you can see that like that moment of exhausted despair when you've been chasing something for a really long time and finally you get to stop and you go, ugh. You can see that on his face, and you can see the weight of the character again, which is why I was talking about it. As he smacks into the wall, you can see how, like, here's the hit, and then you can see how he kind of bounces back from it into a standing position. You can see how his jacket, the little bits of the jacket, move and settle around his body as his momentum comes to a halt, and the little belts that he's got going on. And all of that, like, some of it is probably rendered with the help of some kind of a physics engine, but all of it comes down to decisions that the animator makes about how this character moves. And they have to make these decisions about, like, the physics of the jacket and the motion of the body and where's the weight of the character, like they're standing on the left leg, on the front leg, where's their center of gravity, alongside all of their considerations of what's the character's emotional state, how is he thinking, what kind of personality does he have. So an animator just like doing something that seems so completely mundane and simple as like this is a crap ton of work and a crap ton of expertise that goes into making this work even a little bit. And the trouble with animation is that when it's really, really good, it's invisible, like you barely even notice it. When it's not quite there yet, when it's not quite good enough, you see every single flaw. So that's kind of the point I try to make in these animation breakdowns. It's like, when you see really great animation like this, anytime you don't see the animation happening, anytime you're not thinking about the mechanics, or, ooh, hey, that didn't look quite natural, anytime that's happening, it's because someone very clever and very competent spent a hell of a lot of effort making you not notice. Speaking of, by the way, the aesthetics of the thing, might as well bring that up. Most of the environments that the characters move through, as far as I can tell, like, they are a mix of 2D and 3D objects. So something, for example, like the background that Phoenix is standing up against here. He's called Phoenix, right? I haven't actually been looking into Valorant lore, so I'm not that familiar with the characters. But something like the gun, for example, has painted on textures that fit into the rest of the world that he's in, and same thing goes for the rest of him, but that is not a painted illustration like the backgrounds is. That is a 3D object with painted textures on, which is a really hard balance to hit, to be honest, like, to make that look good, so that a character can be 3D animated but still fit into the world that they're placed in. The same thing goes for, take a look at the waterfalls here in the background. As far as I can tell, it's probably a mix of, like, some of it is CG generated, but as far as I can tell, the waterfalls here, specifically the waterfalls, are hand animated, in the sense that, like, someone painted these frames onto the background. While something like the birds flying in the background there are probably 3D objects that are just rendered really small and then blurred to give, like, the effect of being looked at from far away by a film camera, which is the other interesting thing about the history of 3D animation, and especially in more recent times, is that 3D animation for a very, very long time tried to mimic the look of physical film, of like actual Hollywood filmmaking. And Pixar were at the very forefront of that evolution. Like, they started it in Toy Story, and they really, like, when you dig into the technical details of all the different ways in which they emulate the visuals of camera footage, like the flaws that happen with different camera lenses and how they distort the spaces that they're filming. Pixar have been obsessive about mimicking exactly the ways that Hollywood film cameras capture movies, because for Pixar, for their purposes, having that filmic look, like, helps them sell the feeling of the films that they want to get across. But Simultaneously, there's also been a push in the other direction when you look at stuff like, for example, Into the Spider-Verse, which very specifically rejected a lot of that. Like, it still used a lot of the techniques that were developed, but they rejected that aesthetic of trying to look like it was filmed like a movie camera and started incorporating, okay, what can we do with 3D animation when we don't actually have, like, when you have a camera, it needs to focus on something, right? Like, some things are in focus, like Phoenix is here, and then some things are not in focus, like the background is here. Into the Spider-Verse goes, but we are rendering this in 3D animation. We can have all of it in focus all at the same time, and then we can apply filters and effects to it to make it look more interesting. Valorant isn't doing that, but I just thought I'd bring it up because that's one of the stylistic divergences that are happening in 3D animation, is that some people are starting to experiment with, okay, let's not make it look like a movie. Let's not make it look like use that same film language. And speaking of film language, those black bars on the top of the bottom there, those black bars, the funny thing about the history of black bars like this is that they only exist because of television. Movies, you may know, are often shot in like really extreme widescreen format aspects, and people who know more about film history can talk about that more efficiently than I can. I think Movies with Mikey have a great episode about a film called Galaxy Quest where he talks extensively about aspect ratios and how they're used, but when you see black box letterboxing like this was a thing that was done to cinema movies to make them fit on home televisions. Because, well, they were shot in wide aspect, but like home televisions tended to be in a 4:3 ratio, and so they couldn't show the whole thing. And the first thing that filmmakers tried to do in order to make Hollywood movies fit on television was something called pan and scan. H-Bomber Guy has a great video essay that he created with Shannon Strucci called Scanline, specifically about VHS. Go watch that one if you want more history about that. But where they would scale the image up and then they just sort of pan left to right in accordance to what was happening with the scene. It was really unwieldy and bad, but they wanted to use the full real estate space of the screen. They didn't want the letterbox. Then they realized that was a terrible idea, and so they started releasing actual widescreen format home VHS versions of movies, and that's where this letterboxing begins to come in as an aesthetic, is because, well, we need this really wide image to fit on a screen that is taller than these images that has a wrong aspect ratio, and that's why they're there, and you can see them being used here. Like, this is Valorant doesn't need to do this. Valorant wasn't shot on film. It wasn't shot in a wide aspect ratio. It doesn't need to look like this, but they have overlaid these black bars, these letterboxes, to give it a more film-like aesthetic, because these letterboxes became associated with this is what a Hollywood movie looks like when you're playing it on your home television. That's where the letterbox come from. That's like every time you see it, that's what it's emulating. That's the aesthetic that it's trying to copy. Even though, again, this is they can just make it bigger. Like, it's 3D animation. They don't have to do this. They can make it as big as they damn well please, but they want the aesthetic of cinema overlaid on top of it, which is not necessarily like a deep artistic statement or anything. It's just that's what they want this to feel like. Anyway, what were we talking about? Right, character animation. Let's talk about character animation again, which is really the thing I'm most interested in. I just keep getting distracted. So back to performance. Now, once again, we can't hear what he's saying right here because I've intentionally turned the audio off, but what's his mood? What's his general attitude towards the world and towards other people? What kind of person is he? You get all of it, I think. Like, the gesture that's most telling about him is that, like, he's listening to stuff coming through the earpiece from the operator, controller, whatever. There. That's the gesture that tells you who he is. That's the gesture that tells you his attitude and how he's feeling about the situation. He's mouthy. He's got a big mouth on him. Like, he likes to talk back. He likes to be sarcastic. And he's also like, ugh. Like, you can see that kind of, the whole thing, like, he closes his eyes, like, ugh, and the eyebrows go up, and you can see he's rolling his eyes a little bit, like, ugh, really? Why do I have to deal with this nonsense? So he has that kind of cheeky, world-weary attitude about him. And that all comes across just from character performance. Which it's the thing that fascinates me about character animation is, like, they're just moving this little 3D polygon puppet around, and yet I look at it and I invest it with life. Like, I see this as a person with a personality and an internal life. He doesn't have an internal life. He's just a 3D puppet that was told to move by a computer. But I see a person. I can't not see a person. I am, like, my brain forces me to relate to him as a human being for some reason, which is endlessly fascinating to me. And that comes across to, I really love the mouth animation on this guy. Look at this, like, when he's responding. Like, there, that, you can see how he curls the lip up a little bit so he shows his teeth, and he's got, like, the eyebrows up. He's got this kind of, what? Why shit? What? No, I'm trying, god damn it! Like, you can see that kind of teenage, like, frustration with part of the situation, but also a determination. Like, you can see the moment he's done talking to the controller person in his ear. Look how, like, he's about to look around the corner. So here he's got this whole thing, like this god damn it expression on, like with this kind of disconcerted annoyance. And then closes the eyes, settles the jaw, looks around the corner, and this is a very different person all of a sudden. This is someone who's actually like, okay, well, let's do this. Who's actually taking the thing seriously because he has to, because he's not showing off for anyone. He's not talking to anyone else. It's just him and the job. And then you get that very different attitude from... I love this frame. This is so good. Look at that. It's such a good frame. Because he's like... It's like where he's going, ooh, and he's pulling his head back. And you can see he's getting ready to say something. You get this lovely face. Oh, there's a reaction image if I ever saw one. And again, little detail. Look how his hair kind of flops around with the movement that he's making. And that's a difficult thing about hair specifically, because like especially when like a white Western European like me thinks about hair, we think of small thin strands that flutter in the breeze and move around too much and become incredibly inconvenient when they're too long. I'm really glad I don't have a ponytail anymore. But that's a different thing than, for example, in African Americans or a person of African descent. Natural hair has a different gravity to it. It has a different movement and a different structure, which again is one of those things that as an animator you kind of need to know about in order to animate it properly. And that's the kind of weird knowledge that you have to have just in order to animate certain kinds of characters. And again, look at, like, again, the mouth on this guy is such a big part of his expressiveness, because you can see it when he looks around the corner here. There, like, look how this little curl on his lip over there, look at that. How that's kind of, like, that little movement right there. How it widens his expression just a little bit. And then there, like, that's also a great part of the expression. And then you get into him talking again, right? Like, there's so much great movement. And this is sort of... one thing you'll see in anime, typically, is because anime is, as a format, as an aesthetic, is really, really based around a profound consciousness of budget, because anime tends to be produced on a really fast schedule and under horrifying working conditions that we won't talk about in this particular video, but it's also a format that was basically invented, like, anime was originally inspired and influenced in many ways by Disney movies, but they were constrained by the fact that they didn't have a Disney-level budget to do animation with. So many of the techniques that anime uses were invented specifically as cost-saving measures. It's like, for example, the thing in anime where you have the colored background that sort of cycles through and you get these speed lines just going in the background, that was invented so that they didn't have to animate a whole background moving, but they could still get a sense of speed from the character, and they'll typically just have a static picture of the character really not moving at all as the background flies past behind them, just made up of speed lines. That's a cost-saving measure, something we'll see, by the way, in this particular short a little bit later on. But one of the things that anime does, and which you can see if you watch anime with the sound off, is that when anime characters talk, a lot of the time what you get is just a static picture of the face, and then the mouth moves up and down or opens or closes, does what's called lip flaps. Sometimes they do actual lip syncing, sometimes they really don't. But that's one of the things that, like, anime sort of pioneered as a cost-saving measure, is not investing a ton of time and effort into elaborate talking animation, but just doing what needs to be done to get the feeling across, okay, this character is saying stuff. I bring that up because that's something that's kind of filtered into certain kinds of 3D animation as well. Like, I see it every once in a while where characters really... Like, it's clear that the animators were told not to... were told not to prioritize expressive mouth movements, for example. You can see it often, for example, in anime video games where, like, even though you can create somewhat more elaborate talking animations for 3D characters that can cycle on loop, in order to mimic the anime aesthetic, they just have moving mouths without actually moving the rest of the head. Anyway, that's the opposite of what's happening here, where you can see that Phoenix, like his entire head, like the eyes are screwed up. You can see the cheekbones moving. You can see how like his jaw is shuttered a little bit out to the left here, creating this kind of bumpy profile for him. You can see how the lips are being used to emphasize the expression. And you can see like how the whole face, like he goes from this very wide mouth to this very thin mouth and then back into this sort of dismayed expression that's really being communicated by his upper lip here. Like you can see like that dark shape that it provides gives so much character to the mouth movements. It's really great. And as this, like that's good. Look at that. Like he goes from this screwed out like and then into this kissy face, and then down, like the whole jaw drops and brings the head with it. His head profile gets longer, and he gets this look on his face that really, you just get the sense that this guy is talking straight from his heart, right? And that's something else you can do with character animation when it comes to talking, is you can communicate so much personality just by how a character uses their face when they're talking. And this guy, you can see he emotes, like he doesn't leave anything hidden. He's not subtle about what he's feeling at any given time, because that's part of his personality. He is this brash, loud young kid, or young man, perhaps is a more accurate way to describe him. I don't know what his canonical age is, which also gives us that sense of his character, of who he is, how he behaves, how he thinks. And that, like that, it's so good. And you can also see, like he goes from this fairly restful position with his mouth, and then look at the left side of the lip over here as he gets into the sneer, as he gets into the eye roll. You can see that part of his lip just lifts up a little bit, just like that little bit of teenagey kind of eye rolling at their parents kind of sensation. It's so good. I love it. Anyway, remember how I talked about speed lines in the backgrounds? Here, you can see some of those same techniques being employed on the background as he's running through what's happening here. You can see that there are literally speed lines being rendered on the background, and this smearing happening on the background as well, which is something like when you film that with a real film camera, a character moving quickly through a scene, you do get motion blur. Like that's an artifact of how film cameras work. In 3D animation, you don't need motion blur. It's not a natural thing that happens just because, like some screens and some rendering techniques can introduce it, but 3D animation itself doesn't come with motion blur built in the same way that a film camera does. So if you want motion blur, you have to create it. And again, for a long time, the aesthetic that a lot of 3D animation went for was one of, okay, let's just emulate exactly how motion blur looks on like a cinematic camera. But this is not that. This is motion blur being created through artistic means. This is an artist or an illustrator who creates these smears of color and these long streaks of bright white to communicate the speed and the movement, even though, like, as you can see when we frame by frame our way through it, it's not like the background is moving past that quickly. It's like, yeah, he's moving, but it's not like it's speeding past at the speed of sound or anything. But when you see it in motion, like, you get the sense that he's running his ass off, like he's just completely pounding pavement, he's going so quick. And that's what the speed lines do for the scene. They give that sense of velocity, that sense of motion. Without the speed lines there, he would look a lot slower. Why did I say it? Slower when he was running. And again, personality. You can see it again, that kind of, God damn it, why is she running? It's like, just stop, God damn it. You can see that frustration and the bit of a DreamWorks face here with the eyebrows. All of it just communicating personality so well. And also notice that some of the speed lines just occasionally are rendered on top of him, so that the speed lines are not just in the background, but they also pass over his own body, which works really well. Now, Jet has a couple of great animations. And also, by the way, talking about speed lines, look how they're applied here when we get this over-the-shoulder shot on him. Lots of speed lines over here next to his body. Lots of distortion, lots of color smearing. But nothing on the opposite wall, almost. Like, there's a little bit, but nothing like the extreme color smearing that we're seeing on this side, which also, I think, helps communicate, like, the sense of speed, that this wall is going past faster than that one because that one's farther away, so the one that's closer seems to be moving past faster. But you can also see that those speed lines, like that color smearing, it never goes past Phoenix himself. In front of him, everything is completely clear. Behind him, everything gets smeared out, which again helps communicate the speed of the scene. And then there's... Just a second. There. This is pure anime. These are anime reaction speed lines. These are impact speed lines. They're the kind of thing that you see when an anime character goes, oh, a thing is happening to me. But here they're being used in 3D animation, which is decidedly not anime, but the technique has crossed over and has found use in 3D animation from Western studios, which I really like. I really quite like that. Anyway, let's go back and look at Jet. It's been half an hour and we're 30 seconds into this animated short. Strap yourselves in, boys. So, let's look at Jet as distinct from Phoenix. Now, we don't get really a full body shot of Phoenix running here, but you kind of get the sense of what he's doing. Like, he takes one step, one step. Like, he has this kind of hunched over forward, kind of very masculine run, really, where he's taking long strides and running, like, bent forward, but that's a very different run than what Jet is doing right there. You can see that she's, like, completely, almost like horizontal in the air, dashing around the corner. Where he has this much more, like, doof, 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 doof. She feels more bouncy and a lot more agile. Just from the way she runs right there, you get the sense of, like, this is much more someone who's more parkour than a sprinter, basically. And again, momentum. I love when animators are good at momentum, because you can see he turns around the corner and he's about to chase her down. But he's going this way, and he's going that way pretty quickly, so... bonk! You can literally see him. He slides across the ground, smacks into the wall. And again, the expressiveness of Phoenix's face, though, I mean... I love in-between frames. In-between frames are the best. Zup, zup. Me sliding into your DMs. Me getting rejected. And look how they use the lower jaw on the character. Like, look how he slams into the wall. And then as he starts to move back this direction, like moves back to the left, look how his jaw kind of trails behind a little bit almost. Especially here, you can see how his jaw is kind of still struggling to catch up with his face. Which is this very rubbery aesthetic that's sort of these little rubbery touches here and there. I still... Oh, this is funny. I mean, it may only be funny to me, but it's extremely funny to me. And I do love the little, like, you see the adjustment he makes. He slides into the wall, these crates are in his way, and then in order to move past them, you can see how he lifts his leg up and kind of tries to move his leg over the crates as they're falling down, and then gets back into the run and the stride. And again, about momentum. He's trying to create forward momentum towards us, like into the frame. And you can see how he kind of has to drag his gun and his body behind him and then slowly bring it up in front of him, and then he breaks back into that steady, stable run. And again, so much expressiveness in this guy's face. I love it. And the speed lines are back. And then we get Jet, who I don't know how, like, with the hairdo that she has, how does she hide that underneath that thin hood doesn't weigh 30 pounds. How is it holding her hair down? I don't know. You're not supposed to think about it too hard, because when she leaps and jumps, the hood falls back over and it reveals that she has a ponytail and a giant hairdo in there that we just couldn't see before because of reasons. So again, the contrast in running styles, which again is the thing of, like, I talked about how facial animation alone, just the way a character talks, can do a lot to express their personality. Well, the same thing goes for a run, because where Phoenix has this, like, hunched over, like, you can see how he moves his upper body back and forth. He's holding the gun in front of him. That's the primary thing. So he has this upper body heavy thing where he kind of sways back and forth. Jet has a completely different running style. She, like, the arms are pumping back and forth. She's leaned, like, practically horizontally into the wind as she treads across, and you can especially see that here as she gets ready to do the leap. And there's a lot of good setup being done here, because we start with her in this steady run, right? And then here she does one jump off her left leg, in order to gather momentum. And then you can see how, like, her whole body compresses almost like a spring. And then as she puts her right leg down, that's the one that leads her into this spin, which goes into the leap as the knives come out. And then we get this glory shot of her, showing herself off in, like, a really cool anime pose, just hovering in the air for a second. Lots of good bullet time. And then I love this detail, like that as she starts to throw the knife, the text behind her gets scattered like it's a cloud of smoke. And also, notice the distortion here. You see how her arm... Here, her arm is, like, all the way back there, which I'm not like, is that physically actually possible? Maybe someone who's more flexible than me. I'm sure she is. It's a very uncomfortable position because it's an extreme pose. This is a wind-up. She's winding up to throw the knife. It's an extreme pose, and it slightly breaks her character model. But even more is when she throws. Like, look at this. What the hell is going on with her arm and elbow here? You can see that I think what the animator is doing here is they're forcing foreshortening to happen. Now, here, I think what's happening, and this is a technique that Overwatch uses extensively as well, especially in their play of the game intros, you can really see them do this, where I think they intentionally inflate this part of it. Like, they make her hand a little bit bigger and they make her arm a little bit longer than it really is on the character model. They break the model in order to emphasize the power of the throw. And that's where you get this slightly distorted looking, because, like, this is foreshortening that's being heightened, and it looks artificial to me, where they make the arm and the hand bigger in the frame to really emphasize that she's really throwing this knife at, well, not quite at, almost at the viewer. And then you can see that it snaps back into an ordinary shape as we... Boom. And then it snaps back into an ordinary shape, and she gets to hover just for a couple of seconds in the air in this cool pose. This is the follow through and some secondary motion from what she was doing. And I think you can kind of see you can see it again here, like that. I'm reasonably sure that here we're getting a little bit of distorted perspective, where they're breaking the character model a bit, making making the perspective more extreme in order to heighten the strength and speed of the movement. And it works really well. Like, you get these really dynamic moments out of that just look really cool, especially in motion. Let's see this in full motion, because it looks silly when you're frame by frame, but when you see it in full motion, you really get the sense of pop. Poof, poof, poof. Right, you can really see the... I don't think they're doing it here, necessarily. No. Here they're letting the knives do the thing. And by the way, the trails on the knives are also speed lines. Like, they're surrounded by this white aura, which presumably is at least partly her wind energy, magic, whatever it is in the lore. But it also gives them this sense of speed and power as they streak towards Phoenix. And I love... You can see him... He sees it coming, dodges, and you can see that little head sway. Like, he just kind of sways his head, and then... Rip. And you can see he takes a breath here and holds it for a second, and then... Whoa! And you can see how they synchronize it with... Like, here he lands on his left leg, but to the right of us. He gets another step, and then he's landing on his right leg, but to the left of us. And then he sees the third one coming. He's like, oh, I'm right in its path. Uh-oh. Whoop. And you can see how his left leg on our right here comes down. He takes a breath, and then you can see how he bounces himself out of the way right as the thing comes past, and he lands back on... I think he lands back on his right leg. And then settles back into the run. Missing that one knife is coming. Just look at that expression. You can see that he's looking at the knife, so he gets this cross-eyed look. Bonk. And then here. And again, look how they're using, like, they're letting the jaw trail a little bit behind his motion. He starts to, like, snaps his head forward right here. And you can see how the jaw just has, like, this one frame of catch-up that it has to do, which gives his face this wonderful expressive elasticity. Like, it's so good, I love it. Jet, unfortunately, doesn't get to say much. Ooh, interesting little detail. As he pulls the knife out of him, rather than blood, we get a streak of fire. as though fire is like illuminating him from the inside, which is something that the character design is already doing. You can see it in his jacket. Almost as though the jacket, rather than just glowing with his power, is maybe a thing that partly contains him a little bit from just bursting into flame all the time. I don't know, maybe. But what's interesting to me is that the little streak of flame there is hand animated. And it's animated on ones as well, because it kind of has to be. And look at the hair, again, look at how it bounces. Look at how it moves in the wind. Like those little tufts of hair just like, yeah, that's good. Here's a lovely shot, by the way. When you want, like, the point of this shot is to see, okay, he's looking at Jet, he's chasing her down. So we want this to be steady and focused. Like, we want the viewer to be able to see this tiny little figure right here, outlined in the frame of this light shaft coming in between the buildings, and we want that to be steady. We don't want that to be shaking around or distorted by speed lines, but we still want a great sense of speed, as though Phoenix is moving really, really quickly to catch up with her. But we don't want to move the background around too much, so we have this really, really low shot where we just kind of do this rolling foreground of bricks that kind of roll into view really, really quickly. But we can keep the rest of the scene relatively steady and provide that focus and make it easy to see what's actually going on. And here comes some great effects animation. And again, here, I'm not 100% sure that they're doing distorted perspective here. They might be, but they probably don't need to, given the camera angle. And again, all of these fire effects are hand animated. Like, there's lots of glow effects and stuff being applied to them, but they're all hand animated. And they're all animated on ones, as far as I can tell, as well. Yeah, which again is probably sensible given the composition of the shot. And again, you can see how his body language changes when he has the flame in his hand. Rather than doing, like we talked about before, how he had this rhythmic upper body swaying left and right to his run so far. Look how he runs now. That's a very different run. Where, like, he's keeping his hand steady. And you can see he's kind of stabilizing himself around that hand, because that's where all his power is concentrated. That's all his focus. So he's kind of like, he's running a little bit more smoothly in order to steady that hand. And then he grinds to a halt. And then we get the throw. And again, some lovely effects. Like, I love the clever thing about doing these animations in 2D, like the effects animation in 2D, is that you can do stuff like that. Well, you can do that in 3D as well, obviously, but I think it looks better in 2D. You can get this, like, you get this, the whole sense of his movement, like that big swing of the arm that he's setting up for, which you can see as well as he's sliding into view here. You can see how here he's getting ready for it. He's winding up for it. So you can see how his head is about to move left. And you can see how he's leaning into it, like his whole upper body leaning into it and dragging the arm behind him as though he's carrying a great weight on it. But what he's actually carrying is power. So you get this wind up of like, which sells the power of the swing so well. Because it's like he's throwing something heavy, right? Even though it's just fire, but his body behaves as though he's throwing something that has a lot of weight to it. And the swing, again, is being emphasized. You can especially see it here. Like, that circular motion, that dynamic circular motion is really being emphasized by the effects. And then, ba-ba-boom! And here, I would not be surprised if all the flames are... Yeah, all of it is animated on ones, which again makes sense. And now we finally get a proper look at Jet a little bit. And she has a very different facial animation than Phoenix. Like, because my sense is that if Phoenix was running along and he suddenly saw, well, not a field of fire, he probably wouldn't care about that. But if he saw a pool of poison or something in front of him, his reaction would be more than this. Did you catch it? That was her reaction. There. That's her reaction shot. That's all she does. She's running, and then she goes, uh-oh, and then she makes a decision. And that's a very, very different character aesthetic than Phoenix, who's like, as we talked about extensively, his face is so animated. He's always moving and doing things with his jaw and his eyes and his eyebrows. Jet, you get the sense it's a completely different personality instantly. Just from that, because her reaction is just that. It's like, oh, there's fire. Well, I have wind powers. Oh, this is... Here you can really see the distorted perspective. Here you can really see they're intentionally making the foot bigger so that it comes into our space more, so that she can land on it and jump on it. You can see that they're intentionally pumping it up. That's really clear from here to here. You can see that's not the same size foot at all. That works really well, too. And I love just the elasticity of her movement. Like, look how much she can bend, how flexible she is. And then, again, hand-animated wind powers. Foof. And a bit of squash and stretch. You see how, as she's coming down for the landing, how her whole body kind of stretches out a little bit. It gets just a little bit longer than it's supposed to be, and then it squashes back down together. This is a very basic animation principle called squash and stretch. Goes back to the 1940s and 30s, probably. Typically credited as being invented by the Disney animators. One of the very basic principles of animation. Being used here sparingly, but efficiently, just to give her movement that little bit more bounce. And I love the little detail that, like, she lands on the roof tiles and she cracked them. But then when she runs, when she sets off with that foot and that foot kicking off, you can see that she kicks roof tile off as she moves. That's just it's a lovely little detail, but it works really well. And again, remember what I talked about? Jet's reaction to fire, literally like an ocean of fire being in her way, is to barely react at all. Look how he reacts. Like, rough, much more of a facial expression on him as he realizes that he has a clear shot at her. And again, speed lines being used to do the quick zoom in, which is the kind of thing that you'll rarely see in anime because zooming in on a static 2D background can be problematic under certain circumstances. And then some very simple static shots. One thing to notice, momentum and recoil. Look how his body reacts to it. We don't get a lot to see. We get 1, 2, 3, 4 frames, but you can still see like the whole shoulder rocks back a little bit. The whole body kind of does that little bit of a move back. And that's so necessary with guns. Like with gun animation, when you have a character firing a gun, you can have a character who doesn't react to recoil at all. That's typically the kind of thing you'll see, for example, like with the Heavy in Team Fortress 2, doesn't react to the recoil of his giant minigun. And typically, like with really large characters with really large guns, you'll often emphasize how impervious they are by just not having them react to the recoil at all. But not having, so for example, Phoenix here react to the recoil would make the gun feel much less powerful. It's the same thing as when he's running and he's throwing the fireball as though it's really heavy. The same thing here. If the gun doesn't have recoil, it doesn't feel powerful. Now, one thing... Ooh, lovely. One thing about these animated shorts that I've talked about before, especially with the Bilgewater short that they did for Misfortune and Graves and Twisted Fate recently, is like, when you have guns in animated shorts like these that are supposed to promote a video game that's like not mature, that's like for kids 13 and up, like, or PG-13, that kind of thing, you have a problem when it comes to gunplay, because like you need to show characters shooting at each other with guns because that's what they do with the guns, but you can't actually show what a gun does to a person. It's the same thing with like why Phoenix, when he gets stabbed by the dagger that Jet throws at her, like that thing is clearly like it's gone through his jacket, it's in his flesh. There's no way he hasn't been wounded in the shoulder. But instead of blood, no, he has fire inside him, which is fine, he's not bleeding. Which is those little moments of creative censorship, which is such a big part of animation history in general and just art history. This is how you get around that. Let's see. Boom. And then, lovely flash frame, turning the image black and white, and then inverting the colors. Which is a great way to just emphasize that little moment there when he hits her with the gunshot, but he doesn't hit her. Like, he doesn't hit her body at all. It just barely misses her shoulder, and instead it hits the strap that's holding the spike in the bag onto her. And she does a very clever thing. Like, you can see she's the shot spins her around, even though it didn't really hit her. Spins her around in the air, and then she just grabs the bag quickly, pulls it down to her, And you can see, and this again is part of the visual storytelling, is like, that bag is really fucking important. It's important to Phoenix. It's important to her as well. So important that she'll grab it, pull it to herself, and smash into roof tiles with her back in order to protect the bag and fall off a roof and fall down to the ground down below and somehow survive it in order to protect the bag. You can see her entire posture as she's falling is just about protecting the damn bag because what's in it is so important. And then, ouch. Oof. Now, I'm not 100% sure that that's exactly how momentum works because she's clearly falling straight downwards with no forward momentum, and then she hits the ground, and then she falls forward like another 8 or 9 feet. Not 100% sure that's how momentum works in real life. Not sure that's how physics works in real life. But this is 3D animation, so we don't have to care about how physics work in real life. We just have to make it look plausible. And it does. Like, when she lands from this at full speed, because you remember all the forward momentum she had, you just go, oh, yeah, no, she bounces forward. That makes sense. Like, a ball would probably do the same thing, except human bodies aren't balls. When they land from a great height, they tend to fall down and stay there. So that's fine. And again, look at her facial animation. She's been seriously hurt here. Like, she's almost been shot in the shoulder, fallen off a tall building. I love her eyebrows, by the way. And still, her reactions are very, very static, very calm, very measured. She looks up, she sees the bag, okay, that's where that is. Then she looks around, then she spots him, and then she has a shock reaction, but a very small one. Like, it's just she goes from here to here, with very little secondary motion, with very little, like very little extraneous expression of the face. And again, same thing he does here that he did before. Holds the fireball back, and then throws it like he's throwing something really heavy across the ground, or rolling a bowling ball in this case. And you can see she makes her decision immediately. Need to get to the bag is important, and then... God, great 2D animation. And you can see again the difference is like, so many expressions. And then, oof, ouch. And again, those little moments of censorship, because she just got blasted by a fireball a mile wide. But no, like burn wounds? Nah. Burns on her clothes? Nah. Any kind of visible injury whatsoever? Nope. Which again is like, it's the kind of thing that like you can't show her having explicit 3rd-degree burns on the entire front of her body from being blasted with a fireball. That wouldn't be okay. So you just kind of have to sell the power of the blast in other ways, like for example by doing this. We talked about speed lines before, smearing the background. Here we have another kind of smearing going on. This is light smearing. And this is something that, again, you'll often see it in anime. It's not exclusive to that, but in anime often you'll see like when a character is being blasted with a big powerful blast of light, what you'll get is shapes in the environment that are solid on the front, but then you can see these streaks of light like kind of streaming behind it as though power is radiating forward so powerfully that it's distorting the entire space around what's happening. And that's being used here extensively to showcase the power and the speed and the movement of the blast as it slams her into the wall. And again, some lovely animation going on. You can see she's being tossed like a rag doll, basically. Completely distended in the air, and then she hits the wall with her, basically the small of her back first and her butt, and then the rest of her body gets pancaked against the wall like she's in a cartoon. Again, not necessarily realistic physics where she would begin to slide down immediately, but physics that work for the purposes of the animated short. Boom! We get this moment of impact where we really get to see how much this probably hurts. And then gravity sets in and she slides down the wall. And then we get a callback. This is exactly the same shot that we got right here. Exactly the same shot being repeated. And that's part of the structure of this animation, is we begin in time a little bit forward of where we started. Oof. Now, not a lot to say now, I think, that I haven't said already, except that, again, that little tilt there, like that little twist of the head as he moves back and you get this confident expression on his face. Excellent. And again, contrast that with Jet. Contrast that with, relatively speaking, how little her face does. Now, part of her being so relatively less expressive than Phoenix is a general trope in animation that I'm not very fond of, which is one where male characters often are allowed to have their faces much more distorted, to have their faces be much more expressive, like do much more cartoonish stuff with their faces they emote, while with female characters sometimes, I don't know if this is the case with Jet, as I've already said many times, it's probably more the case that they want to showcase that her personality is a little bit more cold and calculated. But sometimes it's the case that they don't want to do that same level of expressiveness with the female characters because they're supposed to look pretty. And they don't want those reaction frames like the one I found with him. Where when he does this, they don't want those frames for they don't want that distortion, that air quotes ugliness for female characters. Again, don't know if that's what's happening with Jet here, but it's something that does happen in animation in general, which kind of annoys me because I'd like to see female characters be as expressive and extra as the male ones. But again, Jet, this is probably because she's a much colder, more calculated, calm character. So her reaction here is, again, much more understated. Like, you can see she even does much fewer head movements in general than he does. Phoenix is always moving his head back and forth. Like, he's swaying it back and forth. He's always, like, he's looking up. He's emoting. He's expressing his feelings with just the movements of his head. Kind of like he has this kind of peacocky feel about him. Like, he's really showing off. He's strutting all the time. She doesn't do that. She stays very still, moves around as little as possible, and figures out what to do. And you can see, but even then, you can see the plan forming in her head. You can see that she's looking around, first, like establishing what's the situation, and then you can just see from the eye movements that here, she starts to think, okay, what am I gonna do? How am I gonna handle this? Ah, it's such good facial animation. Like, it's so good. Look at him. Look how much his face can do. And then we get this lovely shot of like, all right, let's do this. As he's about to Leroy Jenkins when his whole jacket lights up as well. It's such a good badass shot because all of a sudden you get the sense of, oh, he's been holding something back this whole time. And this is also the moment when he looks least human. Like, this is the moment when he looks most like he's some kind of demon or something. Like, he's not quite a normal person. And I really like it. Like, it's really well realized. And again, as far as I can tell, all of the effects animation coming off his back there and coming off his body all seems to be hand animated and animated on ones, unlike the flames, where again you can see we've got this 1, 2, 3 thing going on, I think. And then we get this beautiful, like, I love this. She literally blasts a hole through the fire and dashes through. And you really get this Nothing Personnel Kid moment. As he looks back and he's like, oh, shit. And this is the first time we get to see some real emoting. Like, it's the first time we get to see Jet even talk. We can see she's kind of pleased with herself. That she's managed to win out over him despite being cornered and kind of in a bad situation for most of it. Sorry about that. Boom. And then again, those little moments of censorship where she shoots him, but we don't get to see what happens when a bullet actually kills someone, which is what happens. The bullet kills him, except he's Phoenix and he has regeneration power, so it's fine. I wonder how, if we get more episodes of this, I wonder how they're gonna handle that, because like at some point they need to show someone being actually shot and hurt in order to establish that these characters can actually, like, in order to have stakes, there needs to be the possibility of characters actually getting hurt. And not all of them have immortality powers like he does. So, I don't know how they're gonna handle that. And again, love the expressiveness of, like, him, like, just adjusting the jacket. By the way, notice how the knife wound that he had in his shoulder disappeared the moment it wasn't important anymore? Like, he doesn't have the knife wound, for example, here. There we go. Oh, yeah, no, actually, he does. Oh, so the knife wound, even the knife wound regenerates. That's clever. Okay, I thought they actually just abandoned it when they didn't need it anymore. No, they made a point out of actually regenerating the knife wound when he does the revive thing. Oh, that's good. That's clever. Nicely done. Good little detail animators. Because oftentimes, with character models, like they if you do put battle damage on them, you just kind of abandon it when you don't need it for storytelling purposes anymore. This time around, clearly they remembered it. I love that. That's a good face. Very expressive. And then we get this situation where clearly something happened while he was out. Presumably the spike was set off and then some anti-gravity, blah, blah. I don't know what the lore of Valorant is, and I mean, given that I'm probably not going to play the game because I am terrible at tactical shooters, I don't think I'm going to be finding out. But if there's more animated shorts like this one, oh boy, I'm going to talk about them because the animation quality here is off the scale, and I like it very much. Anyway, if you have enjoyed watching me gush over two characters doing something for about 2 minutes, but yet I talked about it for over an hour, or maybe less than an hour. I don't know how long this is going to turn out. Just like, comment, subscribe buttons down below, and good for numbers algorithm go up, make good happy. Yes, please. I would certainly very much appreciate it. Outside of that, I have a Patreon, a merchandise store, and a tip jar. If you want to use them, I'd be grateful for the help, and if you don't want to, that's completely okay as well. At the end of my videos, though, I try to encourage people to, generally speaking, support online content creators with direct contributions whenever they can, for a couple of reasons. First of all, because ad revenue doesn't make a lot of money at the best of times, and so especially for smaller and niche content creators, making like any money whatsoever off of the content that they make really relies on direct support from their audience. And like a $1 or $2 donation, like pocket change, can literally be the same as thousands or tens of thousands of views on a video, so it makes a huge amount of difference. Secondarily, in times of global crisis like we're going through right now on multiple fronts, good lord, so much, advertisers tend to pull their advertising from online platforms because people spend less money generally on consumer goods, especially when unemployment rates are soaring. And so for some YouTubers, they've seen declines of as much as 50% of their ad revenue. Now, that hasn't happened to me, thank God. Like, my ad revenue has stayed, I saw a drop of 10%, but it's pretty stable. So that's not really a concern for me. But for some YouTubers, especially people who do niche content, food content, travel content, they've seen like really steep declines in their ad revenue. So more than ever, they need support from their audiences in order to be sustainable at what, like even to just stay at the same level that they were before at what they do. So if there is online content that you enjoy, consider supporting it directly with small contribute, anything you can, whenever you can, because it matters so much more than you think. Anyway, outside of that, I have a second channel as well that I'm supposed to advertise because that's how doing YouTube for a job works, and I do Let's Plays over there. I play some Legends of Runeterra. If you're interested in that, I play decks that people send to me, and I'm very bad at it, but it's extremely funny, people tell me, so you can go watch that. I'm also doing a playthrough of Final Fantasy IX over there, and eventually I'm going to get around to also finishing Majora's Mask on that channel, and I try to do, like, story, lore analysis, animation analysis, character design analysis while I play through those games as well, so if you're interested in that kind of thing, that's over there for you to subscribe, like, comment, blah, blah, YouTube algorithm, etc., too, as well. That's everything. I'm done advertising. Thank you very much for watching, and please remember to wash your hands. Please remember to wash your hands is the thing I was trying to say.